This segment is brought to you in part by the Canadian Historical Arms Society, owners of the Genesee Range, the premier recreational sport and training facility in Western Canada. See us online at historical-arms.com.
The Quiet Professional, a podcast about law enforcement, security, justice, and politics. We are digging deeper on the issues and going where the information takes us with access to experts and authorities. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everybody, welcome back to The Quiet Professional. As we approach Remembrance Day, I'm continuing with our series on service and sacrifice. I've got several guests lined up to talk about their experiences in training and deployments, the memories, the people, and impacts of service. I have my co-host, Ben Klick here. Ben spent 20 years in the Canadian Army. Now he teaches mental management and marksmanship for military and law enforcement applications, as well as instructing civilians. He is the owner of Sierra 6.4 Riflecraft. And our guest today is Dr. Michael Petrou. Dr. Petrou is a historian who joined the Canadian War Museum in 2022. His areas of research include veterans, oral history, war's impact on society, Canadians in the Spanish Civil War, Canadians in the Special Operations Executive, and conflict journalism. He is currently the lead historian for In Their Own Voices, an oral history project that explores the experiences of Canadian veterans and their families from the Second World War to present day. Dr. Petrou sits on the board of directors of St. Mary's University's Gorsebrook Research Institute and is a fellow at both the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and the, I hope I'm saying this right, Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He has worked many years as a foreign correspondent, and he's also an author and professor. So welcome, Dr. Petrou.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you for being on here. And just for full disclosure, we kind of arranged this last minute. So I want to just acknowledge the Canadian War Museum. And if I'm saying the name right, is it Avra who's doing all the emailing to set this up?
Avra.
Yeah. Okay. So we were originally scheduled to have Dr. Tim Cook on here. And obviously with his unfortunate passing in the last week or so, we were able to get you on the show. So I'm very appreciative to you and the War Museum for setting all this up and being willing to come on here and talk about this. It's a true loss for Canada and Canadians alike. So,
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, I miss him a lot. I know a lot of my colleagues do as well. He was a mentor. He was a good friend and heck of a historian and a better person. I think he touched a lot of people. That's been coming out in a lot of the stories we're hearing from all over the place. Just very generous with his time, his expertise. I miss him a lot.
You know, I will say when you go into Indigo or Chapters, and the doctor had a full shelf dedicated to himself in there. Like it was crazy the amount of books that he had and thorough. So I really liked his work.
Yeah, it was. He was incredibly prolific. I can't think of anyone else that was able to be both so scholarly and have that depth of research, but also be able to pull together these compelling narratives to combine that sort of academic clout with just good storytelling. I mean, it's usually you get one or the other, but to have both and then to have it at such a pace, such a volume, it amazed everyone. He told me he used to, of course, everybody asked how he did it, and he said, he'd like to have a monk-like kind of retreat in his basement, for a few hours, from 5 to 8 every morning, which explains some of it, but not all of it. I get up early too, and I don't have 19 books, so he was something special.
Yeah, and I mean, he was working right up until his last days because we had this scheduled for this Friday. I had some correspondence with him, and even when I was looking at his website, he had events scheduled right throughout the month, like leading right up to Remembrance Day. So the guy was still busy and active.
Yeah, I think he was. We were all hoping, he would come back.
Yeah, certainly. Well, we'll go on with the show here. We're going to start just kind of talking a bit about yourself and some of the work of a historian. If you could let us know, because I haven't had a chance to talk to a historian before, how do you even get into this field? How did you choose this as a career path, and what's it been like?
Well, I've taken, I think, an unusual path. I I began my career as a journalist. In university, I stumbled into the Queen's Journal student newspaper during my undergrad, and kind of felt like I'd found my tribe. Just the irreverency of the journalists. The kind of in retrospect, we thought the issues that we thought were very important were perhaps not as important as they seemed at the time. But nevertheless, we had this kind of crusading take on the student government, take on the administration, take on everybody.
Hmm.
Um, and so I kind of felt like I found my people, and believed in journalism. But I was also had this love of history, so I picked journalism first, and in 2001, I'd been working for as a journalist for a few years, and this is on the September 11th attacks. My editor here at the Ottawa Citizen had sent me to sent a bunch of us to New York. I mean, this was back feels like a lifetime ago, but only 25 years ago, the newspapers had resources, and when the towers were coming down, the news editor just started pointing at people, in the newsroom and saying, "You get in cars and drive to New York." And so I did, and then by coincidence, when you're young and you have a little bit more freedom, I had actually done a long backpacking trip through China and the tribal areas of Pakistan the year before. So no one had been to Afghanistan in 2001. But I'd been on the border. I'd
Yeah.
hired someone in Peshawar. We drove to the Khyber Pass, and we looked into Afghanistan. At the time I was very smitten by the romance of the Great Game and Alexander the Great, and then so a year later there was the attacks by the Al Qaeda that was sheltered by the who were sheltered by the Taliban. So I was able to convince the editor to send me to Afghanistan to cover the war in 2001. So I went there that fall and spent about a month with the Northern Alliance, the Afghans that were fighting the Taliban, and that was a very impactful experience on me for many reasons. But it also kind of launched my career as a foreign correspondent. So um, again, that kind of side of my life was taking off, but I still had this itch to do a PhD in history.
Okay.
And I applied and I went to Oxford and did a doctorate there, and still kept my hand in journalism. I wrote while I was there. I worked for the BBC. Got my degree. I wrote my thesis on the Spanish Civil War, Canadians who fought in it. Came back and went right back into journalism. So I was always kind of straddling these two worlds. And I don't think they're opposed. I think being a journalist made me a better historian. I'm not
Mhm.
on Tim's level, but I can write in a way that is not painful to read. It might not be enjoyable, but it's at least clear. And I think being a historian kind of gave me a little bit of insight into some of the stories that I was covering. Spent a lot of time in the Middle East, writing about the ongoing aftermath of the First World War. So I was kind of doing both for a long time. And then, about 4 years ago, I, made the switch, and Tim brought me on here to the War Museum, and it's also felt like home. It doesn't feel that different than journalism. I'm researching, I'm telling stories, and talking to interesting people,
Okay.
but now my deadlines are more relaxed, and we're able to go in more in depth, and it's been a really fulfilling ride so far.
You know what? That was kind of maybe the contrast that I was thinking of as well. So they're not mutually exclusive, but it's just the level of depth, I guess, is what it comes down to. So you have more time to flesh out a full story.
Yeah. And things have changed, for young journalists out there. I feel for them. Even in, the 10 years I spent at Maclean's from 2006 to 2016, so much changed. Like in the early days, I would go somewhere and, spend a week or two, reporting and gathering information on the ground, and I'd come home and have another, week or two to write my story. And by the end, it was, every day we'd need to file something for the internet and then videos, and it just the pace became so much more intense, and then you couple that with the general collapse in journalism and the decline or the diminishment of resources that people can put towards stories, and it's meant that some of the I feel like I kind of got the golden age.
Yeah.
Even then, it was probably the bronze of the copper age. But I was still had a little bit of time in this era where we were able to dig deep into a story. And that's changed, but to be able to step back and have even more time and to go even deeper as a historian. Again, it scratches the similar itch, but
Something new.
it's very fulfilling to dig deeper. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly before the hyper speed of the internet put a lot more demands on
Yeah.
people, right? And combined with the decrease in resources available that some might have, then yeah, stories are just kind of getting pumped out there real quick.
Yeah. I remember there's a couple of times when I remember once I was it's in my mind now because of uh, Darfur region of Sudan, and things are going so poorly there now. But I was in next door Chad, and like I could go to a place like that, and my editors knew where I was, but they weren't that concerned about when I'd be back,
Yeah.
and they'd lose track of me, and I just kind of had that freedom, which I don't think I don't think people have anymore. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking on your career as a historian, and talking about how we frame stories, because it's a big part of what we're talking about today. I'm wondering, when you guys decide, or well, maybe we'll even go before that. How do you decide on what stories you want to tell, and then how you're going to tell them?
Sure, and that's a good question. So, I mean, what stories we decide to tell in terms of an exhibition topic? I mean, that is, the historians and others, pitch ideas and we discuss them, and then we put our pitches in writing, and they're evaluated, and sometimes they're audience tested.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know all the details of how it's done, but there are stories that are on kind of on a short list, or
Mm.
exhibition ideas that are on a short list. Generally, a historian will write an ideas paper kind of proposing this, and then they're evaluated, and some make the cut, and some are maybe sent to the miners for percolate for a few years and are resurrected, and others we go with we don't go with, or we go with right away. So there will be the exhibition topic, and then there will be a team of generally historian or curator, project manager, creative developer whose job will be to uh, figure out how to tell the story and how to physically mount it at the museum. And there's just a lot of workshopping and conversations. I mean, I think one of the gifts that Tim had in his books was picking stories that speak to a larger theme, and we try to do that at the museum as well. I don't want to generalize all exhibitions, but I think exhibitions are more compelling when there's people can feel invested in the story that they're learning about, either through an individual or through an artifact. Of course, like the artifacts that have a story behind them are more interesting than ones that kind of seem sterile or don't have that sort of backstory.
Well, I guess it would be maybe the tangibility of it. So when you actually have like a physical object there, or you have a veteran who like tells their story, they give the oral history. When you combine all that, it makes it more real. People think like I could reach out and touch this rather than just some kind of nebulous idea floating around out there.
Yeah, that's a holy grail. If we can have an artifact, that speaks to something that happened, and if we can have an individual that's connected to that artifact, talking about it, that again, I think that makes it a more emotive experience for the museum visitor. And that hopefully will resonate deeper, and then hopefully will mean that those sort of stories and what they've learned will stay with them after they visit our gift shop and go home at the end of the day.
I like the plug there. So yeah, no, when you're talking about the process, I figured it was a panel that obviously has a say in it, right? It's a big uh, organization that's going to decide we're going to roll tanks in here, we're going to park them in the floor, we're going to tell this story in this way. That's a lot of work, and a lot of people have to go out and find that. Um, I was just that was very interesting, like how you kind of explain the amount of process that goes into it, writing the stories out and almost pitching them. Would you say that if somebody wants something put in an exhibit, then they have to come in with the full picture? Do they have to? Can you put an exhibit out when you only got, 50% of the story? Like, do they put a limit on it? They go, hey, you know what? We just don't have enough. Kind of like you're saying, you got to let it percolate a bit, and maybe we'll collect some more over time.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. So the first thing I'll say in terms of objects that we have for the exhibitions, I didn't know this when I started at the museum. I thought we had a lot of cool stuff in the exhibition galleries and in Le Breton. And then, a week or two in, and one of my colleagues says, do you want to see our vaults? And I guess I knew we had some stuff, tucked away in closets or something. I had no idea. The Canadian War Museum is like, Hogwarts in the Harry Potter movies with the stairwells,
Yeah.
and there's all these hidden hidden halls. We have so much cool stuff, in our vaults. Uh, I mean, thousands, tens of thousands, likely hundreds of thousands of paintings and uniforms and, Sten guns and big commission torpedoes.
Yeah, it'd make it hard to choose. What am I gonna
Right.
what do I wanna highlight?
Exactly. So we have a topic, and of course, one of the things that goes into, the evaluation of, what if we're going to have an exhibition might be, do we have material to help illustrate this? And you mentioned oral histories. I mean, sometimes, we don't have the physical objects, but we have, oral histories. So then the question is, how do you make that part of an exhibition? We have a great exhibition right now, Last Voices of the Second World War, featuring interviews, certainly very interesting objects as well. It's about the kind of coming home after the Second World War,
Okay.
but it features a lot of oral history interviews that I did with Second World War veterans, and some of those were filmed, and some of them were audio. But how do you integrate that into a physical exhibition? And they've done some really interesting things. They have this really nice interview with a veteran, Reg Harrison. He was in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he met a very good friend during his training named Buddy, who had a fiance, and Buddy would always ask Reg to add a little footnote to the bottom of his letters that he would write home to his fiance Jean. And Buddy was killed, and then Reg visited Jean on his way back home, actually here in Ottawa at the train station. They met, and of course, he marries her, and they have a long life together. And it's a really touching story. So we have Reg telling that story. In the backbone of the story is my conversation with him, but it's supplemented with this kind of really creative, like animations and photographs from the families, and it just kind of like we're taking an oral history and sort of making it this like immersive experience. So we'll try to do, we can do things like that with oral histories, and then sometimes we just have, neat objects. I mean, a lot of them are, in the halls, and some of them are hidden. We got group of 7 paintings. There's some are out, some are in our vaults, and it's a real treasure trove that we have. Eventually, we're going to run out of space, and I'm not sure what we'll do then. I guess.
Yeah, you're gonna need an expansion in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you're looking at the stories, is it always about maximizing impactfulness? Is there a certain thing that you're always trying to get to with every story? Is there, a common theme
Yeah.
from all of them?
I mean, I can't. I'm not the one that has a final say. So it's not. It's kind of a bit of. I can't give all the criteria because I don't know. I think like
Mm.
all historians, we make our pitches, and some are successful and some aren't, and not. We might have a favorite that is passed over and cannot possibly understand why anyone didn't pick this. But I mean, the question for me, that I think is foremost, when we're making a proposal is we need to be able to answer the question, why should Canadians care about this topic?
Mhm.
And there could be a lot of answers to that. I mean, that it's something that's been on, it's a major part of our our history. I mean, like, Second World War, for example, changed Canada. It continues. The ripples continue. Um, it might be a story that hasn't received a lot of attention. It might be a story that has become relevant. And this is where things get tricky because we're a museum, but I also believe in public engagement, and we're not just an attic full of old stuff. I want to have those conversations, with the public. So, you know, um, I've been working on an exhibition on the Arctic, for example. And that's
Pretty relevant.
very,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
When you're talking about that, though, I wonder too, like, so when you bring up a story and you make a pitch, how do you decide how to tell the story? So whether it's good or bad or both, whether it paints Canada in a good light, Canadian soldiers in a good light, or in a bad one, because obviously we've seen in human rights abuses or different things. So I'm wondering, when you tell a story, how do you decide how to frame it, or what angle to talk about it from? Is it based on relevancy, current events, and this is what people are talking about? Do I want to change their mind? Do I want to lead them further down that road? Like, it seems super complicated to me, and I don't envy that job. So,
Yeah, I think like our only, and I hold to this, and that there in the history of the museum there has been times when this is been contested, and I'm sure there'll be challenges in the future. I hold to the belief that our only obligation is to the truth. We're a museum. We're not a place of veneration. I think most of us at the museum do respect and admire the Canadian Forces, but that's not our job. Our job is to tell the story, come what may, and that's might upset people. But if we lose that, then we lose our credibility, and then we lose everything. Um, and I would say it was interesting. So we had, I've been involved in this oral history project. Um, so I've interviewed 200 veterans and their family members from the Second World War right up to Afghanistan and Iraq, and peacetime too. And of course, I ended up feeling close with many of them, but I was never, I never saw my job as to celebrate them, or to honor them, except, and I think this is important. Like, I think trying to understand someone's experience is a form of honoring them.
mm,
Um, and this was very much about the post-service experiences, and I think military service is, and Ben might have stuff to say about this himself. It impacts people in many ways, some positive, some difficult. But I wanted, and we wanted to get at all those experiences, some of which are painful, some of which are perhaps more uplifting. But the goal of the project was never to understand veterans, not to honor them, right? And or not to celebrate them. But like I said, I think trying to understand these messy, complicated truths is a form of respect. So that's kind of what guides any angle that I would take, personally. But we don't. I mean, and again, I think most historians have a similar professional ethos. We're not Veterans Affairs. We're not the Canadian Forces. We're editorially independent, and we have our professional standards and our goals that are unique, to museums. And again, it's that dedication to the truth, which is elusive and contested and disputed, right? I'm not denying that, and probably never achievable. But that's the aspirational goal as I see it.
yeah. You know, and if Ben, if you got to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, I was just wondering. The job is to connect and to tell a story. How do you strike that balance between the absolute truth of, or approach to the best guess of truth? How do you balance that with the need to frame that story in a current context? where societal norms and expectations of now, how do you present that sometimes pleasant truth in a way that actually engages people? Because if it becomes too unpalatable, I can imagine that the visitor is simply going to walk away from it. How do you strike that balance between current expectations and social norms and the reality of the past?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I say a couple things. Like, I think we need to be clear-eyed about the past, and I think and sometimes that that involves confronting you know uh, topics racism and other forms of exclusion or discrimination. I think we also need to or try not to judge our forebears or judge the past through the lens of the present. And having keeping that in mind, I think is important as well. So again, it's recognizing the flaws in the past, recognizing that we will probably be judged harshly by our great grandchildren for ways we can't imagine yet. So trying to engage with the past, um, keeping in mind the reality in which those people lived in. In terms of the unpalatable nature of war, I wouldn't have guessed this, but Tim, my recently passed, colleague and friend whom we were discussing earlier on, he always used to, I never had to sit down. I almost never had a sit down meeting with Tim. We'd go for walks, often along the Ottawa River or through the galleries. And he would do this all the time. Like he was always walking through the galleries, watching people, looking at the exhibitions, and that mattered to him, that sort of public engagement. And a lot of our meetings would be strolling through the galleries as well. Countless times I walked through, First World War, Second World War, Cold War, well, starting with early contact. So the four galleries, the Breton. And there's this one section of our First World War gallery, which is kind of like an immersive experience. It's like I think they're called the duck boards, through like a recreated trench scene. And and it's brass, it's metal, and there's like the mud and the filth um, on either side of these duck boards, including bodies, that are half submerged in the water. And I wasn't here when the museum was moved to our current location. But Tim had mentioned to me that having that was people were very uneasy about it. I guess when they were designing the First World War exhibition, because it was showing the horrors. It was showing unburied bodies strewn about as people were walking to and from the front, and the guests are walking through something that's similar to that. And the concern was, where was it? Is it too graphic? And Tim fought to have that as part of the exhibition. The line he said was, we're the Museum of War. We're not the Museum of Peace. And I think that was the right decision. I think that's an effective display. But I mean, of course, there are things that we're not going to show. And I don't know where that line is. And my colleagues and I might have different ideas, and I try to listen to my colleagues, and we talk about it. I know even this online. I've been working on an online exhibition. This in their own voices. This oral history project I've been doing. We've posted a lot of the interviews online, and there's a great interview with Mark Dauphin, who was a doctor at the Kandahar airfield. And he's discussing, injuries to the children, violence committed against children. So we include that, and there's, some sort of advisory notice before that comes up. That's something that's become more common now, which maybe we wouldn't see 20 years ago. So we're all kind of figuring that out.
That's going to be a tough road.
Answer is
No, thank you.
And just kind of going back a little bit to what you were saying earlier, just about trying to be almost impartial and just telling the facts as they come. It made me think of just doing like police interviews, and when we go in, it's like whether you're interviewing the complainant or an accused, you're just there to gather the facts. So it's like, tell me your story. I'm not judging you. I'm not looking to lead this down anyway. We're not asking leading questions. It's just, I'm here to gather the facts, and then I send those off to court. So I kind of, it was just making me think of a similar process to what you were saying, and when the facts come in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I spent a long time as we were talking about as a journalist, often, having confrontational conversations with people in government, and I was recently up, up north with, I was embedding with Operation Nenduk, the Canadian Forces operation on
And
Baffin Island, and great experience, right? It was fantastic. Things went great. Um, but then I was having long conversations with public affairs officers, and I think we saw eye to eye and got along. And the point that I made, and which I think they agreed with, is like it's better for everybody if you know your audience, your museum visitors, your newspaper readers, whomever, like know you're editorially independent, and know you're fighting for that, and you'll hold to that. Because again, as I said, otherwise you lose your credibility, and then that makes you look bad. And in the case if you're embedding with the Canadian Forces, it makes them look bad. It's in everyone's best interest to let the truth come out, or the closest proximity to the truth that a historian can get to. And I think that's far better than trying to manage or manipulate. No one's going to hire me to be a
yeah.
media relations expert, but that would be my, if I was ever on the other side of the fence, that would be my advice. So
Well, maybe this kind of be along the same lines, but I'm just wondering, have you ever experienced anything like the lobbying or some of the special interest groups that come in and say, we don't like the way this is told? Uh, and I ask that because in Dr. Cook's book, The Fight for History, I mean, he goes through a whole whack load of different groups that have come out and said, you either forgot about us totally and you aren't telling our story, or you're not telling it properly. There's ones where they don't like how it was framed, and that kind of makes me think of some earlier points you guys were making, where it's like you could have 10 people come in and give a very coherent version of events and a story, but you might get an 11th person who comes in, has a totally different perspective, experienced these things from a different job in a different way. So it's just, I wonder how you deal with those type of concerns that come up.
yeah, uh, I don't have to deal with it. It usually goes above my above my pay grade, but but they do come in. I know they do come in. Everyone's not. Of course, people are. People will sometimes, they'll have suggestions and advice and very strong advice.
Maybe you experience it even in the journalism world. Like I don't think it's too far off. I mean, you can do a deep dive on something, but somebody
Yeah,
will come up and criticize it, and
yeah, and again, my duty is not to keep everybody happy. It's to try to get to the truth. And I know there's all kinds of people, in groups in the museum, and Tim's written about this, that have had their complaints. And of course, we try to, engage with them, respectfully. But at the end of the day, we're historians, we're not activists, and that's a key difference. You know, uh, you might have your agenda, you might hold it very dear to your heart. Um, uh, and again, we're a publicly facing institution. We engage with a public audience, but we have to make our editorial decisions as we see fit. And again, we do engage, we do collaborate. I'm not going to do an exhibition about the Arctic without spending time in the Arctic, without speaking to Northerners and Inuit.
yeah.
Um, but at the end of the day, the buck has to stop somewhere, and it's with museum staff. We're the ones that have to make the decisions. And but I do see, in terms of museology, there are certainly tensions. And um, my belief, and perhaps this is because of the thick skin I developed, after working for 20 years as a journalist, is you can't do any kind of uh, job like this without upsetting some people.
Yeah.
And I believe you need to be okay with that.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you dismiss them. It doesn't mean you don't listen. I mean, and and when you make a mistake, you apologize, and you try to make it better. But you can't please everybody, and you shouldn't try.
Well, that describes my job to a T every day in law enforcement. Someone's always upset with every decision I make. You know, just as we're kind of coming up to the end of time here, one of the things I really want to make sure we hit on was, do we do enough as Canada, as Canadians, to tell our own story? This was a big part of uh, Dr. Cook's writing, and something that I was really reflecting on, and he made mention quite a bit in there just about how the Americans and the British, they were pumping out movies, and it's like they all kind of just gathered around like a common narrative of what their purpose was in some of these wars and how they carried out their business. But when it came to Canada, it's just been like if we're not self-flagellating, we're just not doing the greatest job at putting out some of that content, whether it's movies, whether it's radio. Like, we took such a different path through the storytelling side of it. And it's I just wonder, do you think your opinion on what we did in the past, and are there changes coming in the future? Obviously, the War Museum, they put money in. We have this nice newer museum, but that's in Ottawa, and it's like, well, what are we doing across the nation? How are we telling these bigger stories and choosing to remember it?
I think you're right, and this goes into, this is a big question about the cultural differences between Canada and the United States and Britain, which I don't have answers to, other than to say, you and I were talking a little bit about Tim's book, The Fight for History, and he does talk about this, how we, for so many years, Canadians, when we talked about the Second World War, we fixated on the disasters, Dieppe, Hong Kong, the alleged, human rights violations with Bomber Command. We didn't, we didn't celebrate, some of the triumphs and
Hmm.
the grinding through, through adversity. Um, and that was deeply frustrating. And there was this public change in 1990s, as Tim outlines in his book, with the 50th anniversary and this kind of renewed interest. And you could see this reflected in the size of the crowds, which remain massive, as they will be this year at the National War Memorial here in Ottawa. But in terms of how we tell that story to a popular audience, I think that's what made him so special. But also, I mean, he was fighting a lonely fight.
Hmm.
Like there was not the same kind of uh, mass selling books about Canadian history. We're not Canadian. Well, I know it's a chicken and egg question. I mean, Canadian academic historians, for the most part, are focused on other issues.
Yeah.
There's not the same sort of depth. There is in the United States. When they are written, they're not bought. Publishers are generally publish, memoirs and nonfiction tends in that direction.
Mhm.
Sort of, and it's not just war. I mean, it's the sort of research nonfiction. It's a very tough market for that in Canada. Publishers don't support it. The audience doesn't buy it. I think there are cultural reasons, which again I find frustrating, but I can't really untangle. Other than to say, that were some of the Canadian stories, American ones, there would be multiple Hollywood movies and Band of Brothers type miniseries
Mhm.
and best-selling books written by people other than Tim's. And I don't know exactly what's to blame. I mean, being next to the United States, the behemoth with their own cultural output is part of it. Maybe this sort of like, little brother complex we have had, which we're hopefully, getting out of, vis-a-vis first Britain and then the United States might be part of it. But it is frustrating. And I think the War Museum plays a role in telling those stories. There are historians that are doing important work, and I support and celebrate them and try to add to their output when I can. But it can be frustrating.
Yeah.
The historic, yeah. There's not the historical research and the wartime research kind of community and reception in Canada. Can be a little bit lonely sometimes.
I even think of Afghanistan, and it just seemed like a lot of it wasn't necessarily in the news. And at least from what I can recall, like it doesn't seem like a thing that resonates with Canadians. I think it's largely to do with media and politicians. one of the things that I was doing here on the law enforcement side was I was getting politicians to come out on ride-alongs and try to show them our story rather than just letting them hear it from, somebody who wanted to protest something about police or what might have made it through CBC CTV. It's just, hey, you know what? If you want to know what's going on, I'll show you. Come out and do an entire shift with us. And then I just think on the war side, like the War Museum is just a quick walk down from Parliament. Like, are people interested in this from the politician side, from media? Are they, or is it just our culture and we just,
Well,
I don't want to say don't care, but we just don't make it a priority?
I mean, I think a couple things. I think, yes, people do care. I have to believe they do because, this is how
Yeah.
how I spend my life. Here as a historian. On Afghanistan, it's a really interesting question. Look, I think a couple things are going on. First of all, we talked earlier on in our conversation about the collapse of, journalism, in terms of, being able to afford,
Mhm.
if there was another war, an Afghanistan-like war, there'd be fewer journalists that could spend time with Canadian forces, out of country, which is sad. During the Afghanistan war, I do think the embedding program that the Canadian forces had was very good from the perspective of the Canadian forces and telling their story.
Okay.
They would bring Canadian journalists uh, to Afghanistan, and it was a bit in terms of access. It was a bit of I only embedded once, and I had great access. I was very lucky, but often you get complaints from journalists about not being able to leave the Kandahar airfield. But when they did, I mean, the experience was invariably positive. Even when the journalists were telling very critical stories about the Afghan detainees, I mean, there was still that respect that the journalists had their job to do and the soldiers had theirs. So from a public relations perspective, I think the embedding program was a very smart move from the Canadian Forces. I think it resulted in good journalism. It resulted in questions about, and these are important ones, about, if can you be objective if you're embedding, if you're, you know, eating with soldiers, if you're sleeping with them, if you're relying
Yeah.
on them, for their safety. I mean, those are valid and important questions. I think you can, but let's discuss them. So I think that program was very good. I will say that there is not a culture of transparency, uh, in my experience. Certainly the higher up you get in government departments and in the military as well. I know Murray Brewster, who spent months and months
Mhm.
embedded with the Canadian Forces. In his book, The Savage War, he talks about his frustrations. Again, not so much with the soldiers on the ground, but with their public affairs officers. And then as you got higher up, and then when you got back to Ottawa, just these comical kind of attempts at message control and manipulation.
Yeah.
You'd have politicians in Ottawa complaining like, why aren't you telling the story of the good work we're doing with this development project? And journalists in Afghanistan was saying, we've been begging to get out and see that project for weeks, and you won't let us. So
Yeah.
and access, same thing with access to information. It's a work intensive, difficult
Yeah.
process to work our way through, to get at some of that information. So, again, sunlight's a disinfectant, so if there's a little bit of a cultural change, on that end, I think that might result in, perhaps a little bit more storytelling as well.
Yeah. Awesome. You know what? I think it's a good place to wrap. I could ask you questions forever. This is a very fascinating topic. So, you know what? I really do appreciate your time and Ben's time as always, and especially scheduling this last minute. So, I want to say thank you for being on the show today, and we'll have to do this again in the future here, a little more on the history.
Well, thanks for having me, Nathan, and it's good to talk to you, Ben. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you very much, and keep up the good work chasing truth.
Thank you.
Hey everyone. Thanks for listening in and following along with the discussions. Be sure to click the follow or subscribe button on your respective listening platform. Also, check out the Quiet Professional on X and Instagram under TQP780. And most importantly, please share where you can. Everyone has a part to play in getting these education and information pieces out there. So pass it along. Thanks again.